From an anthology of Hertfordshire history collected by a friend of mine, Ralph Thoresby, May 1695. Had some showers which raised the washes from the road to that height that passengers from London that were upon the road swam, and a poor higgler was drowned, which prevented our travelling for many hours. Towards evening adventured with some country people who conducted us over the meadows, though we rode up to our saddle skirts. That was what it was like to travel on the roads of England at the very end of the 17th century. Roads of England, of course, were notorious at that time. The reason for it was twofold, really. First of all, because they hadn't yet learned about field drainage, about land drainage. The great advance in that science came in the century afterwards. And secondly, because the method by which the roads were maintained was that each village was put in charge of its own stretch of road and had to maintain it without any funds to do so. In fact, there was a man called the overseer who was appointed to see that it was done. He wasn't paid for it, but he could be jailed for not accepting the job when he was offered it. So naturally, the road building was pretty rough. It was an odd way to do it. That's the way the Tsar of Russia kept the telephone line going from Moscow to Archangel. He left a coil of copper wire at every village, and when there was a break in the line, they sent the Cossacks to the village where the break was. I suppose it's still the same, actually. However, the only roads in which you could travel well on those days were the old roads along the tops of the hills, which had been used by the ancient British from the very beginning of inhabiting of England. These were the roads that King Alfred used, these were the roads that the Iron Age people used, and these were the roads which still in the 17th century you could travel in wintertime, the only ones. And they were therefore regarded as important, and as much traffic as possible travelled on them. And that is where we get the phrase, the King's Highway, because it was the high road that you had some chance of moving on in the winter time. Very little chance of travelling at all down below. That's why right up to the Civil War you hear of armies disappearing into winter, King taking his army into winter quarters in Oxford as soon as the winter came, and not coming out again till the spring, because they just couldn't move about. This went on, and our roads were notorious even to foreigners until the 18th century. In the 18th century, they thought of another way of doing it. They started to build the Turnpike Roads. And this is one of the famous Turnpike Roads of England. It goes from Salisbury down from Dorchester to Blandford to Dorchester, from Dorchester down to Lyme Regis. It's the road on which the Prince Regent travelled in his coach when he wanted to go down to Weymouth. And it was built by a Turnpike Trust. What happened was that a bunch of local gentlemen obtained a right through Act of Parliament to build a Turnpike Road, and in return they were allowed to put gates across it and charge people a turnpike fee. When this road was built, it was a piece of engineering absolutely equal to the building of the M1. For instance, you take that long slope that you see in the background. They actually did experiments to discover that a coach and horses fully loaded the team could stay at the trot as long as the road didn't rise at a rate of more than 1 in 30. If it rose at a steeper rate than that, then they were broken down to the walk. And all the slopes on this Great Western Turnpike, which is the name of this road, were engineered to that. And that's why you always seem to be going up a long, slow hill on a road like this. And at intervals were the toll houses, and there is the last one of them that still remained. And at that point on the road, there was a gate across the road called the Turnpike, and an unfortunate man had to guard it, because a lot of people didn't like the turnpikes. The drovers with their herds of cattle and so on. In fact, there was so much trouble that they started off with 6 months imprisonment for breaking a turnpike gate, and they ended up with the death penalty. And at intervals down the road were the famous coaching inns. Surprisingly small intervals, actually, because if a man was going to travel fast, his coach changed horses at least every 10 miles. The number of horses, the system on these roads was amazing, and that sort of thing. There was once, in fact, a publican at Barnet, who had 1,200 horses in a stable as coach changes. And here you come to another of the inns. But this time it's no longer an inn, it's a farm. But if you look behind it, you can see the coach yard still intact. They were amazing bits of engineering, actually, when you realize that they still stand pretty well successfully the heavy traffic to the coast. They cut out the old roads. As you pass here on the right, you'll see a bank, which was the old road which came this way, where it could find comparatively dry ground. And you'll notice always that there are villages to left and right, which is some distance off the road. They used to be on the road, but not after the turnpike was built. But if we turn off here and take this road towards the hills, leaving the metalled road in the valley behind, we can get a glimpse of what things used to be like on the King's Highway in the days when George Borrow wrote, and when the road people travelled in their tilt carts and camped at night on campsites, which were always chosen, if they could, to have shelter around them, hollows in the side of the road, dingles. They camped in the dingles, and they travelled up here. And we leave behind us the wet vale where the dreadful roads were. We climb up this hill, which is a famous hill called White Sheet Hill, and as we go round the corner, we shall jump back 2.5 centuries. The jeep disappears round that corner, and in a moment, we're back in the 18th century, because at last we've finished the vehicle we need in order to conduct this sort of journey. It was back when the snow was on the ground that we first bought this horse Blue, the Blagden horse who was appropriate for the job, and started to train him. And it was back at the same time when we started to build the tilt cart on the old, original and genuine wheels that we found. And now it's complete, as near as we can to what it used to be. And now we're travelling on the King's Highway, and we're travelling at the pace, a pretty good pace actually, for a cob bringing a cart up that hill. We're travelling at the pace of the 18th century. You can scarcely believe it, can you, as you go along the top here and look down below at the valley where the wet roads were and where the tarmac road now is. You can scarcely believe that this is what the King's Highway was like. As a matter of fact, it wasn't quite like this, because in those days this was open downland, and the road itself would be, or the track of the road would be about probably 40 yards wide, 30 to 40 yards wide, because among other things there was a law that you mustn't leave hedge clippings or any other mess within 40 foot of the roadway, because the footpads hid behind it and they sprang out on you. So when we want to look at the next thing we're passing, we've got to get off the cart. I leave him to talk to the Connemara stallion, who's got all his wives up there in the field, and we'll walk out to what was the edge of the wide highway, and you see what we find. A milestone which seems extraordinarily inappropriate in this place, and yet, can you see what it says? It says 94 miles to Hyde Park Corner, 14 miles to Salisbury, 1760. Almost impossible to believe, isn't it? And this, of course, was the pace of the travel. 94 miles to Hyde Park Corner. Well, it's about, by my calculation, about 108 miles by the new tarmac road down below in the valley, which means that the highway was a very straight route along its journey. But Blue and the cart and I would, in fact, get to London between 4 or 5 days at this rate. Down below on the new road, you'd get there in about an hour and 3/4 in the sort of cars that people drive nowadays. But I must say, when you get up there, this seems like the way to travel. Nowadays you would expect almost never to meet anybody up here, except an occasional tractor running along the tops. But in those days, along this top, with all the at least two counties in view on either side of you, you would meet the travellers and the dealers and the gentlemen in post-chaises and the great wagons which carried goods and the droves of cattle driven by the drovers and the flocks of sheep driven by the shepherds on their way to the sheep fairs at Wilton. And they'd pass along this ancient road a long barrow. Do you see that? That is a burial mound from the Iron Age, and a chieftain was buried there. And almost certainly all his slaves and servants were buried with him, because when he died, there it is, you see, when he died, they were slain. They used to say that it was because he needed their attendance in the afterworld, but I don't think it was. It was in order that during his time they didn't plot with a neighbouring lord for his death. They knew that as long as he lasted, they lasted, and when he went, they went. So they really looked after him. I'm sure that was the reason. And here are some people still living and still travelling in the way that everybody did who was on the road in those days. There are few such families. They like their privacy. One thing they don't like is to be hunted out by photographers. But because we met Dave Rawlins and his family by accident, we were made welcome. And they're living and travelling at the pace which was natural to this road in the old days. The reason why they're up here is quite simple. It's spring, and one of the mares that they're travelling with has foaled. And they don't want to load the foal on a cart. There's a famous gypsy kettle iron. An old gypsy said to me, when the knives come through the tent, that's when you grab the kettle iron. It is possible in emergency for them to tie the legs of a foal and put him on the flat cart that follows the wagons. But what they like is to wait until the foal is ready to walk, and then it can travel alongside its mother. And thus it learns its road sense. You can see that one of the daughters is wearing the dress of the fortune teller. She's very much a family breadwinner, and it now looks as if we're going to get a cup of tea, which is very nice. They take the dairy with them on their journey. That goat, incidentally, gives about 1 gallon of milk a day, and, of course, gets very good grazing, because there's nothing they like the mixed herbs of the roadside, rather than the single variety grass of the fields. And there's the reason for the delay. And it won't be many days before it's ready to trot along a short day alongside its mother, who'll probably be in the shafts, incidentally, as they go. So there they are, the originals. this is where the road is really grown in by the thorns to which this whole thing would run back if the sheep were not here. And Blue doesn't like that very much. He's never felt the trees against his cart before, but he soon settled down to it. For the last century or so, this road has been known to the country people, and still is to the older of them, as the Shaston Drove, which means the Shaftesbury cattle... Look at that, he doesn't like it. Which means the Shaftesbury cattle track, because of course the drovers and the shepherds used this road after the wheeled traffic went down onto the turnpike below. But if you look on the oldest maps of all, you'll see it's called the Here Path. H-E-R-E, and an amateur archaeologist of the district told me that that was obviously a hare path, but it isn't. I found the word eventually in the biggest of the Oxford dictionaries, here, H-E-R-E, which I think may have been pronounced Hera. I wish I'd learned Anglo-Saxon. I would have swapped the sound subjects for it. After all, no civilized man wants to understand technology. Any word, the word was here, and it means a host, an army. And I think it may be that Hereward means the guardian of the army. Anyway, this was the military road which Alfred used when he went to fight the Danes, and no doubt King Arthur before him. And here and there you run into a crossroads. On that left-hand side, the track is used because it goes down to the farm. If you look to the right, it's almost disappeared. But it's fascinating, that track, if you follow it down, because it comes to a village in which there's an old stone building, now used by an agricultural merchant, which in fact was built by the Knights of St. John, the original hospitallers, whose job was to look after travellers. And when the pilgrims came along this road, when night came, they went down that path to the village in the wet lands below, and they stayed the night in a dormitory as the guests of the Knights Hospitallers, the ancestors of the St. John's ambulance. And then they came up in the morning again to carry along the way. Everywhere you see thorn bushes, and of course when this road was first used it was all thorn bushes around because it was the sheep that came in the Middle Ages that produced the downland turf and also the riches of Britain. And incidentally, at intervals along this road, there are still the site of sheep pens which the shepherds used when they were travelling the road on their way to the fairs, and there's one of them. That track to the left goes to an area which once was a great sheep pen where the sheep were put. And nobody knows who it belongs to, really, because this is still the King's High Road. And so presumably the sheep pen is still the King's sheep pen, but every now and then you find somebody living up there for a while. There's a family that's stopping there. In fact, they brought their daughter that very nice little Welsh pony, which she's breaking to ride, and what a place to do so. And here's another of the crossroads, and this crossroad is now a modern road. Once upon a time it was just green tracks running down from the valley on either side of what was the highway. Incidentally, Blue was puzzled by this. He travelled so long along this top road, and he'd walked straight across every crossroads we came to. He'd forgotten about crossroads, and when we had to stop for traffic, he practically said to me, "What are you waiting for?" "What are you waiting for?" he said. "All right, you hang on a minute." And at this crossroads we find what there used to be at almost all of them. This is called Hut Farm. And that's because there was a hut there. Hut was an ancient word for an inn, or a trading place. And the villagers used to bring the water up. and all the goods and the things to sell to the travellers. They used to bring it up to the hut in the day and serve the travellers, and then take their carts down again at night. That's why now and again around the countryside you'll find pubs called huts. In our district there's the Meehan Hut, and there's the Cribbage Hut, and that one is the Hut Farm. And past it is one of the established camping places. And this is going to be the end of our first day's journey along the King's Highway. Horses are terribly fit on this sort of grass. I once read about a man who drove his pony and cart to Cornwall and back, camping by the roadside, and he said he'd never known his horse so fit as when he was eating the herbs, because there they can find almost everything they want. But what they can't find up here is water. And as nobody is bringing it up to the huts these days, we have to take it with us. He's terribly polite. He never interferes while you pour it out. He waits till his drink is ready. And now I shall put the curtains up, and we'll prepare to spend our night alone at a camping place which once upon a time was crowded with the people of the roads, all camping together for the night, knowing one another from previous journeys on this and other roads, with quite an elaborate set of social conventions. For instance, it was always up to the first people who settled in the camping site for the night to have a can of tea ready for those who followed them. There's always a bit of a wind, and the noises of civilization could be heard very distantly down in the valley below. And this is the thing I've been longing to do for months. To get on this road with the kind of cart that belonged to this road in the days of George Borrow. So Blue and I will settle down alone to spend the night amid the memories of George Borrow, and guarded by the ghost of his giant girlfriend Isabel, the female prize fighter.